In this presentation, I'm going to be describing a particular systems approach called critical systems heuristics. And of all the various systems approaches that I know, I've always regarded that critical systems heuristics has the potential to be probably the most useful systems approach to evaluators. That includes both the evaluation of particular interventions, but also in the design of really useful and valuable evaluations. I once shocked a large group of evaluators at the American Evaluation Association by introducing critical systems heuristics as the holy shit method. Because for me, once the penny dropped, my response was, holy shit, this is a game changer. There are, however, substantial howevers, and I will talk about those towards the end of this particular presentation. But to get to the however, I need to give you the holy shit pitch first. But actually before that, I probably need to show you where critical systems fits within the entire systems fields canon. The systems field is both old and large. It is informed by ideas that date back literally thousands of years from many parts of the world. The modern systems field emerged from Russian and Austrian thinkers and other practitioners in the early part of the 20th century. And over the past 100 years or so, the field has drawn on many other fields that have inevitably contributed to a large diversity of ideas, interpretations, and cultural orientations. In my experience, the US field of systems is different from the one in the UK, is different from the one in Germany, is different from the one in China, and certainly is different from the various systemic approaches that have emerged in South America. Now, this particular diagram produced by one of systems field's leading figures, Ray Eisen, gives you some idea of that scale and scope. On the left-hand side, he lists a range of fields that have informed modern systems practice. And as you move more towards the right, the center of the diagram, you go through what I would call the emergence of specific disciplines within the overall field. And moving further to the right, there are methodologies and methods that have emerged from those disciplines and sub-disciplines. Now, Ray ordered these along a continuum. At the top are methods and methodologies that are primarily describing the world as it is, the objective reality. In other words, there are methods and methodologies that are primarily ontological. They describe the world as it is. At the bottom are methods and methodologies that explore the world as people see and understand it. In other words, subjective realities. In other words, again, they're primarily methods and methodologies that are epistemological in nature, about learning. Now, as you can see, critical systems heuristics falls right at the most extreme epistemological end. Indeed, in my view, it enters the third great area of exploration, that of axiology, the study of values and valuing. Perhaps for no other reason that suggests its possible relevance to evaluators who ought to be, though often or not, interested in the nature of valuing. To get a somewhat less philosophical understanding of the role and potential of critical systems heuristics, let's start at the very beginning, and that is of what comprises a system. Now, there are many individual definitions, but overall they hover around one that was developed by Dick Morris at the Open University many years ago. Here's my version of Dick's definition. A system is a collection of entities that are perceived by someone as interacting together to achieve something. A system is a collection of entities that are perceived by someone as interacting together to achieve something. Let me illustrate that in a slightly different way. The definition can be split into three elements. The first one is interrelationships, a collection of entities interacting together. The second is about perspectives that are perceived by someone. And finally, to achieve something can be regarded as setting boundaries. The reason why achieving something is about boundaries is because to achieve something you have to focus on something. And in focusing on something, there will be things that fall outside of that focus. In other words, you've drawn a boundary between what is in and what is out of your system. In other words, all systems have a purpose. Now, it may be specifically identified, or it may be what people perceive the purpose to be. And it's for that reason systems are always human constructs. People can identify different purposes of the system, even when the interrelationships are the same. However, in our evaluation craft, we don't just want to describe systems. We want to use systems ideas to influence our evaluation practice and the interventions we evaluate. We want to do stuff. We want to engage in systemic practice. Systemic practice is more than merely describing systems. Systemic practice is about stepping into those interacting entities and influencing, or at least altering the course if possible, of those changes. And I want to stress that this could be within the intervention we're evaluating, or indeed in our evaluation practice. So to turn this description of a system into systemic practice, you need to add some verbs. And here they are. Understand interrelationships. In other words, addressing the question, what is the reality that we're actually dealing with? Engage with perspectives. How do people interpret that reality? And finally, decide on boundaries. In other words, working out what actually is the desirable and feasible thing to do in the vast array of possibilities that we have. Now, critical systems heuristics is a systemic approach to deciding on boundaries to assist our process of desiring of arriving at the desirable and feasible thing to do. Now, a common misperception is that systemic approaches are about looking at everything, the old holism thing. In fact, by now you may be realizing that the reverse is true. Every systemic practice, every intervention, every evaluation is bounded in some way. It's impossible to view and understand every single interrelationship at every available scale. It's impossible to accommodate every single perspective. In order to be able to do anything, we end up having to draw boundaries. Without boundary decisions, we just can't do anything. We will just stand in the lights, scared like a rabbit in the headlights. And when I say doing, I don't just mean actions. These boundaries can be of ideas, of ideologies, of thoughts. So, for instance, in evaluation, we don't just make decisions about time or budget or method. We make those boundary choices, but we also make boundary judgments and boundary choices about criteria, equity, efficiency, effectiveness. And these criteria enable us, they give us the boundaries to make judgments of whether something is of significance or not, of value or not, or of merit or not in terms of those criteria. These are all vital boundaries that allow us to say that something is worthwhile or not, something is significant or not. So essentially, without boundaries, there is no evaluation system. So what are we doing when we make boundary decisions? Now, this issue concerned the systems thinker C. West Churchman, who developed the field of critical systems. he concluded that there will be winners and losers in every boundary decision. And in terms of losers, this can be as simple as falling below the set of standards of a criterion in an evaluation. In other words, be ineffective or inefficient or uncaring, whatever the criteria happens to be. Or they can be as complex as feeling that their interests have been marginalized by the evaluation or the intervention. And since people or things will be profoundly affected by these boundary decisions, Churchman considered that boundary decisions are actually primarily ethical rather than primarily technical. And because they are primarily ethical, they have to be justified in ethical, not just technical terms. We have to be able to claim that whatever boundaries we draw are the right boundaries to draw, ethically, as well as technically. Some people will challenge these claims, and they may have the power and agency to undermine that claim. Therefore, we need to think about, deliberate upon, whether we just seek to boost our argument for the rightness of our claim, or, from an ethical point of view, negotiate an alternative set of boundaries that accommodate this particular challenge in some way. So what we're at the position now is that these in-out decisions that we make, these boundary decisions that we make, are not only technical but are also ethical and therefore require ethical deliberation on the consequences, given that people will be at least marginalized, or ideas will be at least marginalized. The problem is that we make literally hundreds and hundreds of boundary decisions in any particular evaluation. They're decisions of space, of time, of purpose, of money, of control, of knowledge, of perspectives. Which ones should we focus on? We have to, therefore, make some boundary decisions about our boundary decisions. Now, every evaluation situation is different, so is it possible to identify some generic decisions that are vital in every circumstance? One of Churchman's students, interesting in an evaluator and social planner, Werner Inricht, identified 4 such key boundary decision areas and developed a series of questions of heuristics around that. And critical systems heuristics was born. The first of these 4 areas is purpose. In other words, this is a decision between who benefits from an intervention, including the evaluation, and by implication who does not. Who gains, who loses. Then there's the decision over who controls the necessary resources to achieve those benefits. And that's a boundary decision between who has autonomy over those resources and who has the ultimate control of whether those resources are available. In order to use resources, you need information about what kinds of resources and so on. So there is an issue of knowledge and necessary decisions around whose or what knowledge and expertise is used in managing these resources. What knowledge systems is used, for instance, and what knowledge systems are ignored. That's a very live challenge to evaluation right now. And then finally, there is a question of what Ulrich called legitimacy. This is a complex area, but fundamentally it poses questions around the decision about whose or what interests have to be satisfied in order to ensure that the benefits actually occur. It's a boundary choice between desirability, ideal desirability, and the actual feasibility of seeing what you have actually work on the ground and be sustained. Now, these might seem like simple generic questions, but actually answering them exposes significant issues around the use of power, of equity and control of both the intervention and the evaluation. It raises issues around knowledge systems and the reality of compromises and trade-offs necessary, including the compromises and trade-offs necessary for our evaluations to achieve what we wish them to achieve. And the issue of legitimacy around that is a really important aspect of critical systems heuristics, and I would argue something that evaluators really do need to actually take closer understanding at. We're all very interested in the consequences of our evaluation. Legitimacy is a major contributor to whether things are considered legitimate or not. But here's the way that critical systems heuristics actually handles this. The first three aspects, purpose, control, and knowledge, are essentially about who benefits and how they benefit. But the legitimacy aspect brings you down to earth with a bump. Critical systems heuristics people argue that the legitimacy, and hence the feasibility and sustainability of your system, cannot be determined by those who are inside your system. Inside your system are people who will benefit from the system in a pretty direct way. They mostly will support you. Your legitimacy is relatively certain. However, instead, the critical systems people argue, critical systems heuristics argues, that legitimacy is primarily gained by addressing the needs and desires of those who are not part of the system, but whose interests are negatively affected by it. And here is a classic example. A car in a cycle lane. In other words, town planners, cycling groups, cyclists cannot legitimize cycle lanes. The only people who can ultimately legitimize cycle lanes are power drivers and maybe shopkeepers, local shopkeepers or whatever, but they are essentially people who are rightly or wrongly perceive themselves affected by, negatively, by a system of which they are not part. So then the deep ethical question is then how much of those interests do you sweep in, do you include, do you bring into your system before you risk up actually undermining the possibility of the very benefits that you desire. Indeed, if you sweep too much in, you essentially create another system with different issues around what is its purpose, what are the controls, and what are the knowledge, and yes, what's the legitimacy. Only this time, someone or someone else will be negatively affected. What does this mean in practice? Well, there are a total of 12 questions in critical systems heuristics, 3 for each of the 4 major areas. One question tends to explore the who boundary decision, one the what boundary decision, and the third can be considered a kind of so what. It explores some key issues that are raised by the what and the who boundary decisions. They often imply a further boundary decision. And since they are heuristics, a major task is not just bolting the questions on, but adapting the ideas behind the questions to the particular circumstance. Let me step through them progressively. And note that I refer to the intervention and the evaluation, and that's because, as you heard many times in this talk, evaluation itself is an intervention, so we can not only apply these issues to the evaluand, but also most critically to our own evaluation practice. And as I go through these questions, I suggest you reflect on just how consciously you address these questions in your own evaluation designs. Reflect on, or to put it more systemically, how these questions are consciously addressed in the evaluation system that you and others are part of. Start off with purpose. And the questions are: who or what benefits from the intervention or evaluation and how? And what purposes are essentially implied from those benefits? And then the so what is, well, what are the key measures of success? In other words, how would you know? What's the boundary of measurement so that you would actually know that the purposes are being achieved to those particular beneficiaries? And note also that these questions are in a neutral or observational mode: is, are, will, did. But in most situations, and this is where the evaluative aspect really comes in, they also need to be asked in a normative, value explicit mode: could, should, ought. So while I said there were 12 questions, actually in the end there are 24 heuristics to be deliberated upon. Next, we have the issue, the boundary choice area of control. And in this case, the who are the decision makers. So in other words, what components, resources, people, policies are the responsibility of those decision makers? Then the question is, who or what these decision makers will have the sufficient autonomy? What makes up the autonomy? What is the boundaries of their autonomy to make decisions about the use of these components? And then finally, what is outside of the autonomy of those decision makers? And the reason why there always has to be is that if they, decision makers, had complete control of the evaluation or the intervention, then there is actually no guarantee that the benefits will be accrued, because the decision makers could do what the heck they wanted. So somebody somewhere has to be in control of the decision makers, in control of the resources, in control of the time, and so on. So what's outside that autonomy of decision makers in order to ensure that the benefits really are realized? And again, we can put these in the should mode. And very often you will find that a comparison between the could and the should actually raises a whole series of further boundary decisions that may have to be made, or implications of these two boundary decisions between what is and what ought to be, or what should be. Similarly, when we come to the issue of who, what, and so what with knowledge, we have experts, expertise, and I'll talk about guarantee in a couple of minutes. So who are the experts? Who will provide the expertise to use the resources in order to bring about those benefits? Or who will bring additional resources or additional ideas? And then what expertise itself will inform the decision making? And then the guarantee is, well, how do we know that these are the right experts and the right expertise? What are the means by which expertise is assessed as appropriate? And what values should underpin the choice between the knowledge and expertise used and not used or marginalized? Big issue in terms of deliberation over knowledge systems. And again, we have the potential comparison between an idea of what should be. What should be the experts, or who or what should be the experts to provide that expertise, what expertise should inform decision making, and what should be the means by which expertise is assessed, and so on, and what values should underpin those decisions around the boundaries of knowledge. And then finally, legitimacy. Strong words, victims, but this happens to be the language of critical systems heuristics. Evaluators often find that word wrong, but the implication is that by focusing on something, by making evaluative judgments, you are both giving winners and losers, and the losers are essentially victimized by your solution, by your system. So, who or what is negatively affected, marginalized, or disadvantaged by the intervention or evaluation? And then, what is the response to those interests that are negatively affected, marginalized, or disadvantaged by the intervention or the evaluation? And then finally, in order to sustain the benefits, the intended benefits, what trade-offs are necessary and what values underpin a response to the positive and negative implications of the evaluation? And here is a kicker, and it's a particular challenge for evaluators who have this sort of naive, many of whom have this naive idea that whatever we do is inherently good. So who or what should be negatively affected or marginalized or disadvantaged by the intervention or evaluation? What should be the response to interest? This is intentionality in terms of the borders that an evaluation will set or an intervention will set. And then, in order to sustain the benefits, what trade-offs should be necessary and what values should underpin the response to the positive and negative implications of the intervention or evaluation? So that's critical systems heuristics. All very interesting, but what has that got to do with evaluation practice? Well, clearly critical systems heuristics is a deeply evaluative approach. It constantly and consistently asks questions about values. It also covers a range of evaluative issues that I've come across in virtually every evaluation I've done and every evaluation report I've ever read. However, they are generally implicit rather than explicitly managed and handled within the evaluation. They are often tucked away in general observations rather than foregrounded. Furthermore, when I actually take evaluators through a critical systems heuristic using a specific evaluation in mind, it's easy to see why. Although the questions appear simple, and in many cases pretty self-evident, many evaluators really struggle to answer them. That's even more stark when I pose questions around the evaluation itself, around the benefits, control, knowledge use and legitimacy aspects of their own evaluative practice. For me, applying it to my own practice was my holy shit moment. It's a game changer. You never do evaluations the same ever again. But there is another reaction to these questions. And that is, this is all esoteric, it's all academic, it's abstract. These are pretty common reactions. And that's despite the fact that these decisions are actually taken and unavoidable in every evaluation. I'd posit two reasons or two ideas about the reasons behind this particular response. Firstly, critical systems heuristics in particular, but critical systems in general, is actually more interested in a different paradigm than the majority of evaluations. It is interested in whether the right things were done rather than whether things were done right. Critical systems is essentially an approach based on moral philosophy rather than applied social science. It's fundamentally about being able to make the claim that whatever an intervention is doing or seeking to do, it is seeking to do the right thing to do. For evaluators to start including critical systems as part of their toolkit, they need to put aside the field's dominant focus on whether things were done right and focus more on the ethical issues of assessing things were done not according to a specific theory of change or a predetermined value-based criterion, hello DAC, and begin to shift into the area that Emily Gates and Tom Schwandt talk about about value development, not value assessment, value-based assessment. Making evaluation reflect on the significance and worth of the values that underpin an intervention, and of course that includes their own interventions, is the core issue that surrounds critical systems in general and critical systems heuristics in particular. Now, there are approaches like footprint and blue marble evaluations that are heading in that direction, but I don't think they're doing it particularly consciously or deliberately. That then raises the other issue about agency, at which point we cannot avoid talking about the evaluation market, or evaluation as a system, and the ability of individual evaluators within that market or system to take the kinds of decisions that are implied by a critical systems approach. Can evaluators even go there? Or to put it more bluntly, can evaluators working within the evaluation market go there? When I take evaluators through the critical system heuristic, a very common response is, well, we don't just have the ability to ask that question. Most of the boundary choices that critical systems heuristics covered, even in an evaluation, are decided by others in the evaluation system. The funders of intervention, the providers of an intervention, the funders of evaluation. Most of them are primarily interested in whether things were done right rather than whether they did the right thing. Did we achieve what we wanted to achieve or were funded to achieve? Therefore, my observation is that critical systems heuristics needs to be adopted by the evaluation system rather than just evaluators who, frankly, mostly primarily take a data collection and analysis role within the broader evaluation system. When we start thinking in terms of evaluation systems rather than evaluations, then I think CSH questions may be able to gain the necessary agency, or the people in the system will have the necessary agency to find critical systems heuristics useful and valuable. So there you have it, critical systems heuristics and evaluation systems. Note the subtle change in the title. I've been thinking about some of these things for quite a while now, and I'm still thinking. So even though you may have just come across what critical system heuristics is, leave alone had an opportunity to think about what it actually means for your evaluation practice, I'd be really interested in hearing your reactions and thoughts and suggestions.